You probably imagine Rome as marble statues, disciplined soldiers marching in perfect formation, and emperors ruling the world from palaces filled with gold and silk. Power, order, glory. That is the image history loves to show. But history rarely opens the doors after the crowns are placed, after the ceremonies end, and the crowds go home. Because behind those palace doors, some of the darkest battles in Rome were never fought with armies. One of the most brutal wars in Roman history wasn't fought on a battlefield. That it was fought inside a family, between a mother and her son. There are mothers who would die for their children, mothers who sacrifice everything to see their son succeed. But then there was Agrippina the Younger, a woman who did something far more dangerous. She didn't just protect her son, she built him, she molded him. She placed the most powerful crown on earth onto his head. And then she tried to control every breath he took. Some Romans believe their relationship became so twisted that it crossed lines that even Rome, a civilization famous for its corruption, struggled to describe. According to ancient historians, the young Emperor Nero tried to murder his own mother not once, not twice, but 3 different times. Poison failed, a collapsing ship failed. And every time she survived, the hatred between them only grew darker. But this story is not just about a murder. It is about how 2 people created monsters inside each other. One wore the crown, the other put it there. And when monsters begin fighting for control, nobody escapes with their soul intact. Before Nero became emperor, before Rome whispered his name with fear, there was a boy. And behind that boy was a woman who had already survived some of the most terrifying rulers in Roman history. Agrippina the Younger was born into one of the most powerful and most cursed families Rome had ever seen. Her father was the famous General Germanicus, beloved by the people and feared by Rome's political elite. Her bloodline ran directly through the ruling dynasty of the empire. But power in Rome was never safe. That it was a snake pit, and Agrippina grew up surrounded by snakes. Her brother was Caligula, the emperor history remembers as one of the most deranged rulers to ever sit on the throne. This was a man who allegedly declared himself a living god, executed senators for amusement, and reportedly planned to make his horse a government official. Growing up in Caligula's court meant learning one simple rule very quickly: survive or die. Agrippina watched people rise and fall overnight. Friends became enemies. Loyalty meant nothing if someone more powerful wanted you gone. Eventually, even she became a victim of the madness. Caligula accused her of conspiracy and exiled her from Rome, stripping her of wealth, power, and safety. Most people would have disappeared after something like that. But Agrippina was not most people. She endured exile. She waited. She studied the game of power the way a hunter studies prey. And when Caligula was finally assassinated, stabbed dozens of times by members of his own guard, the chaos that followed opened a door. Agrippina walked right back into Rome. But she didn't return looking for peace. She came back looking for a throne, not for herself. Women in Rome couldn't rule the empire directly, but they could rule through their sons, and Agrippina had the perfect candidate, a quiet teenage boy named Nero. There was only one problem. Rome already had an emperor, Claudius, and Claudius already had a son, Britannicus, the biological heir to the throne, which meant that if Agrippina wanted Nero to become emperor, 2 obstacles had to disappear. First, she needed to marry Claudius. That part she managed with frightening skill. Through political manipulation, family connections, and relentless pressure, Agrippina became the emperor's new wife. Suddenly, she was living inside the palace, walking through halls filled with power. But marriage alone wasn't enough. Claudius still had a son, and that meant Nero was still second in line. For Agrippina, second place wasn't acceptable. She began preparing the next step. In ancient Rome, political enemies didn't always die in public executions. Sometimes they died quietly at dinner tables. Agrippina began searching for the perfect poison, not something obvious, not something that would kill instantly and raise suspicion. She needed something slower, something that would look like illness, something that would give doctors time to panic and fail while the victim's organs slowly shut down. Eventually, she found the perfect accomplice, that a woman named Locusta in Roman society, Locusta had a very unique profession. She was what people politely called a specialist. But the truth was simpler. Locusta was a professional poisoner, that if someone in Rome needed a death that looked natural, Locusta was the person they visited, and Agrippina hired her. Together they prepared a deadly dish using poisonous mushrooms, the most dangerous variety found in Italy. The toxin wouldn't act immediately. At first it would resemble simple food poisoning. Nausea, weakness, confusion. Then the real damage would begin. The organs would fail one by one. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it would already be too late. The night of the dinner arrived. Claudius sat at the imperial table, surrounded by servants and family. The Emperor of Rome, ruler of the most powerful empire on earth, and across from him sat his wife. Watching, waiting, Agrippina personally served the dish. Mushrooms. Claudius loved mushrooms. He ate them happily, unaware that every bite was slowly killing him. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then the symptoms began. Claudius started coughing violently. His breathing grew heavy. Witnesses later described him clawing at his throat, gasping for air as poison flooded through his body. Panic erupted around the table as doctors were summoned. But Agrippina remained calm, watching. Within hours, the Emperor of Rome was dead, and standing nearby was a 16-year-old boy. Nero did. A few days later, the Senate gathered to decide the future of the empire. Agrippina moved quickly. Britannicus, Claudius's biological son, was declared too young and inexperienced to rule. But Nero was older, better prepared, already married to Claudius's daughter Octavia, perfectly positioned to become emperor. The Senate voted. The crown was placed. And at just 16 years old, Nero became the ruler of Rome. But anyone who looked closely at the throne that day would have noticed something strange, because standing just behind the emperor was a woman, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. Whispering in his ear, Agrippina had done it. She had placed her son on the throne of the most powerful empire in the world, and for the first few years, everything worked exactly the way she planned. Because Nero wasn't really ruling Rome, coins were minted with both of their faces, printed together, something almost unheard of in Roman history. Messages were sent to the Senate through Nero, but the words came from Agrippina. When Nero spoke, it was her voice. When Nero signed orders, it was her will. The empire belonged to the boy, but the power belonged to his mother. For a while, Nero obeyed, but teenagers grow up, and eventually the puppet begins to notice the strings. And when Nero finally started testing those strings, the relationship that built an empire began turning into something far darker. Because the first thing Nero did that truly angered his mother was fall in love. And that small act would ignite a chain of events that would push their twisted relationship into territory so disturbing that even ancient Rome struggled to describe it. First, the change was subtle and dramatic rebellion. No open confrontation in the throne room. Just small decisions that slowly slipped outside Agrippina's control. And the first crack in her perfect system came from something she never expected to threaten her power at a woman. Her name was Act. She wasn't a noblewoman. She wasn't from an important Roman family. She didn't bring alliances, armies, or political influence. She was a freedwoman, someone who had once been a slave and had later been given freedom to end the ruthless political environment of Rome. That meant she was practically nobody, which was exactly why Nero liked her. For the first time in his life, he had found someone who didn't treat him like a throne that needed controlling. Act didn't whisper political strategies into his ear. She didn't remind him that his power existed because of someone else. She simply treated him like a man. For Nero, who had grown up under the suffocating shadow of Agrippina, that kind of freedom felt intoxicating. But when Agrippina discovered the relationship, she exploded with rage. This wasn't just jealousy. This was a threat. Agrippina had spent years building absolute control over her son's mind. She shaped his education, his friendships, his decisions, even the words he spoke in the Senate. And now a woman with no political value was distracting him from her influence. One evening, she stormed directly into Nero's private chambers without warning. Servants scattered as she pushed through the doors. Inside, she found the young emperor with Act. The atmosphere instantly turned cold. Witnesses later described Agrippina's fury as something almost animal-like. She shouted at Nero, insulting act, mocking her low birth, accusing her of corrupting the emperor of Rome. "You are the ruler of the world," she reportedly snapped. "And you choose a slave?" Then her voice turned sharper, more dangerous. She reminded Nero of something he had heard his entire life. Without her, he would be nothing. She had poisoned an emperor for him. She had manipulated the Senate for him. She had given him the throne. And if he forgot that, she could take everything away just as easily. For years, words like that had always worked. Nero would lower his eyes, nod, submit. But this time something was different. For the first time in his life, Nero didn't look at his mother with obedience. He looked at her with something colder. Resentment. That moment, small as it seemed, marked the beginning of a silent war inside the palace. Because Agrippina immediately realized something terrifying. Her son was changing, and once a ruler begins thinking independently, a puppet master becomes a liability. The arguments between them became more frequent, more vicious. Agrippina began making threats, sometimes subtle, sometimes direct. She reminded Nero that Britannicus, the true son of Claudius, was still alive. The Senate might prefer him. Rome might accept him. After all, Britannicus had a stronger blood claim to the throne. That threat hung in the air like poison, and Nero understood exactly what she meant. If he stopped obeying her, she could replace him. Not long after those threats began, Britannicus suddenly died during a dinner party. Witnesses described the moment in horrifying detail. Britannicus was sitting at the table, surrounded by guests, when he suddenly started choking. His body stiffened. Foam gathered around his mouth as the poison attacked his nervous system. The room fell silent. Everyone knew what had just happened, but no one said a word, because Nero sat calmly at the head of the table, watching. The official explanation was that Britannicus had suffered an epileptic seizure, but everyone in that room understood the truth. The last legitimate rival to Nero's throne had just been removed, and Agrippina understood something else as well. Her son was learning the same brutal lessons she had taught him. Power doesn't ask permission, that it eliminates obstacles. But something even darker was beginning to spread through the palace corridors. Rumors, whispers, the kind of whispers that made even hardened Romans uncomfortable. And that says a lot. This was a society where emperors had married their sisters, where executions were public entertainment, and where political assassinations were considered normal tools of government. That it took a lot to shock Rome. But what people began whispering about Nero and Agrippina crossed into territory that even Roman historians struggled to explain. Point two of the most famous writers of the time recorded the rumors, Tacitus and Suetonius. Both had access to imperial records. Both spoke with people who lived during Nero's reign, and both documented something deeply disturbing. They describe a relationship between mother and son that had become so twisted by power and control that it may have crossed the ultimate taboo. According to Suetonius, Nero often traveled with Agrippina in a private litter, a covered couch carried by servants through the palace. Sometimes they would remain inside for long periods. And when they emerged, witnesses claimed to notice strange stains on their clothing, stains that suggested intimate activity. Tacitus described another incident that shocked even Roman readers. During a banquet, Agrippina reportedly drank heavily and approached Nero with a level of physical affection that went far beyond maternal behavior. She kissed him repeatedly, touched him in ways that made observers deeply uncomfortable. That it was not the behavior of a mother. It looked like something else, and Nero's advisors panicked when they saw what was happening. Point two men in particular were terrified of the consequences. The philosopher Seneca and the commander Burrus both understood that if the rumors became reality, the scandal would destroy the imperial family completely. They acted quickly. They sent Nero's lover, directly to her. Mission was simple: keep him distracted, keep another woman between Nero and his mother, prevent something irreversible from happening. Whether these stories happened exactly as described or were exaggerated by political enemies is still debated by historians today, but the fact that multiple Roman writers recorded them tells us something important. The relationship between Nero and Agrippina had become so toxic, so filled with manipulation, power struggles, and psychological control that Romans believed even the unthinkable was possible. Imagine that level of hatred. Imagine waking up every day knowing the person who controls your empire is also the person who raised you. The person who reminds you constantly that your throne exists only because she allowed it. Nero began seeing her everywhere. In the Senate chamber, in his private councils, in his palace halls, in his dreams. Agrippina never stopped reminding him of one thing. I made you emperor. And Nero began realizing something terrifying. As long as she lived, he would never truly rule. But killing Agrippina would not be simple, because she had spent her entire life preparing for betrayal. She understood Roman politics better than almost anyone alive, and she knew that powerful people rarely died peacefully, as Agrippina had done something few others ever attempted. She turned her own body into a weapon against assassination. For years, every morning, she consumed tiny amounts of poison. Not enough to kill her, just enough for her body to slowly build resistance. It was an ancient practice called Mithridatism, named after a king who had done the same thing centuries earlier. Little by little, her body adapted. Poison that would kill anyone else became harmless to her. Agrippina had transformed herself into something extremely difficult to murder, but Nero didn't know that yet. And soon, he would try to kill his mother for the first time, with the very same weapon she once used to make him. Emperor, poison. And when that plan failed, Nero would realize something terrifying. His mother was far harder to destroy than he ever imagined. By the time Nero decided his mother had to die, the hatred between them had already rotted every corner of their relationship. This was no longer just political rivalry. It was personal, deeply personal. Agrippina had spent years reminding Nero that he was nothing without her. Every time he made a decision she didn't like, she threatened to expose him, to replace him, to remind Rome that another heir once existed. And Nero had reached the point where there was only one solution left. She had to disappear, quietly, naturally, the same way she had removed Claudius. Nero sent for the one person in Rome who understood poison better than anyone alive. Locusta, the same woman Agrippina had once trusted to kill an emperor. When the summons came from the palace, Locusta arrived, quickly, carrying small sealed containers of powders, oils, and extracts. Her reputation had grown since the death of Claudius. Powerful people whispered her name whenever they needed someone removed without public bloodshed. She entered Nero's private chamber calmly, professional, but even she felt something strange in the air. Nero wasn't relaxed. He paced across the room like a caged animal, his eyes burning with frustration and rage. Locusta placed her small wooden case on the table and opened it slowly. Inside were rows of tiny containers, each one capable of ending a life in a different way. Some poisons killed quickly, some slowly, some caused convulsions. Others mimicked diseases so perfectly that even trained physicians couldn't recognize the difference. She had spent years perfecting her craft, but Nero's request was different from any. She had heard before. "I need something powerful," he said. Locusta nodded slightly. "That can be arranged." Nero stopped pacing and turned toward her. "It must kill someone who expects to be poisoned." Locusta paused. That was unusual. Most victims never suspected anything until it was too late, but Nero continued. "She's cautious, extremely cautious." Locusta studied him carefully. "Who is the target?" The room fell silent, that Nero's answer came without hesitation. "My mother." Even Locusta, a woman who made her living from death, hesitated for a moment. Killing an emperor's enemy was one thing. Killing the emperor's mother was something else entirely. In Roman society, the family bond was sacred, at least in theory. A son murdering his mother was considered a crime so unnatural that it threatened the balance of the gods themselves. But Nero was emperor, and emperors were not used to hearing the word no. Locusta lowered her eyes and began preparing the mixture. "If she expects poison," she said quietly, "then the dosage must be overwhelming." She selected several ingredients from her case. Point one attacked the nervous system. Another stopped the heart. A third ensured the poison spread quickly through the bloodstream. Together, they created a lethal combination strong enough to kill almost anyone. Locusta sealed the final mixture carefully. "This will work," she said. Nero arranged a private dinner with Agrippina. The invitation seemed harmless. Just a quiet meal between mother and son. But both of them understood something deeper was happening. Agrippina had spent decades navigating Rome's deadly political world. Suspicion was part of her daily life. Still, refusing the invitation would only make their conflict public. So she accepted. The dinner took place in a smaller chamber inside the palace, far away from the main banquet halls. Only a few servants were present. Nero sat across the table from his mother, watching her carefully. Agrippina looked relaxed, calm, almost amused. Servants brought the food. Wine was poured, and in one of the dishes, Locusta's poison had already been mixed in. Nero watched every movement. Agrippina picked up a piece of food and tasted it. For a moment, nothing happened. She continued eating slowly. Nero's heart began pounding. Soon the poison would begin working. There would be signs: sweating, weakness, pain. But Agrippina simply continued her meal, calmly, comfortably. Minutes passed, then more minutes, still nothing. Nero stared at her, waiting for the moment when her body would betray her. But Agrippina placed her cup down and looked directly at him. And then she smiled. Not a warm smile. Not the smile of a mother enjoying dinner with her son. It was the smile of someone who understood exactly what had just happened. She knew. She knew the food had been poisoned, and she knew she had survived it. The silence between them became unbearable. Agrippina leaned back slightly in her chair, studying Nero's face, in accusation, in anger. Just that quiet, knowing smile. The kind of smile that tells someone their plan has failed. Nero felt his stomach twist with rage. He had just used one of the deadliest poison mixtures in Rome, and his mother had eaten it like it was nothing. The dinner ended without a word about what had happened. But both of them understood. The war between them had officially begun. Nero immediately summoned Locusta again. This time he wasn't calmed, he was furious. He slammed his hand against the table when she entered. "What did you give me?" he demanded. Locusta looked confused. "My strongest mixture." She ate it. Locusta's expression changed. "That's impossible." "She ate everything," Nero snapped, "and she's still alive." Locusta slowly realized what this meant. There was only one explanation. Agrippina had prepared for poison for years. She has resistance. Locusta finally said. Nero's anger turned into something colder. "Resistance?" "Yes," Locusta explained carefully. "If she has been consuming small doses over time, her body could have adapted." Nero stared at her. "You're telling me my mother has trained her body to survive poison?" Locusta nodded slowly. "It's rare, but it has been done before." The realization hit Nero like a wall. Agrippina hadn't just expected betrayal. She had been preparing for it her entire life. Poison would never work. His mother had turned herself into a fortress, and Nero suddenly understood something terrifying, that if subtle methods couldn't kill her, then subtlety was useless, and more secret mixtures, and more hidden toxins. If poison couldn't destroy Agrippina, then he needed something stronger, something mechanical, something impossible to survive. Nero summoned engineers, shipbuilders, craftsmen who understood weight, balance, and structure. And he gave them an order that sounded almost insane. "Build me a ship," he said. But not just any ship, that a ship designed to murder its passengers, that a vessel that would look luxurious and safe until the moment it collapsed and dragged its victims into the sea, that a perfect accident, that a perfect trap. And once again, Nero would invite his mother to dinner. Only this time, the Mediterranean itself would try to swallow her. But what Nero didn't realize was that Agrippina had survived far worse than storms and assassins. And the next time he tried to kill her, the plan would fail in the most terrifying way possible. Because Agrippina wasn't just hard to kill. She refused to die. After the poison failed, Nero understood something terrifying. His mother was prepared for betrayal, prepared for assassination, prepared for the exact weapon he had tried to use against her. Agrippina had survived exile, conspiracies, and one of the most dangerous political systems the world had ever known. She had grown up in a palace where family members killed each other for power. Poison was the most common method, but of course she had prepared for it, which meant Nero needed something she could not prepare for, something no one would expect, something mechanical, something unstoppable. The Emperor of Rome began quietly gathering craftsmen, not soldiers, not assassins, engineers, shipbuilders, men who understood wood, balance, and structure, the kind of men who designed the massive ships that carried grain across the Mediterranean. They were brought into a private chamber inside the palace. The doors were sealed. Guards stood outside to ensure no one entered or left without permission. Then Nero gave them instructions that sounded almost unbelievable. "Build me a ship," he said, "but it would not be a normal ship. On the surface, it had to appear luxurious, elegant, fit for the mother of the emperor, beautiful wood, comfortable cabins, decorated interiors, that a vessel that looked like a gift. But hidden inside that beauty would be a trap. The roof of the main cabin would be designed to collapse at a specific signal. Heavy wooden beams would drop suddenly, crushing anyone beneath them. And that wasn't the only mechanism. The bottom of the ship would also contain a hidden release system. When triggered, the hull would partially open, allowing water to rush in rapidly. The ship would sink fast. Anyone who survived the falling roof would drown in the dark water before reaching shore. An accident, a terrible, tragic accident that a ship lost at sea. The emperor's grieving mother swallowed by the Mediterranean. It was a perfect plan. Cowardly, but perfect. Once the construction was complete, Nero prepared the final step. He invited Agrippina to a festival in the coastal town of Baiae. Baiae was a luxurious resort city where wealthy Romans went to relax. Emperors had villas there overlooking the sea. The place was famous for its parties, its warm waters, and its endless celebrations. The invitations seemed normal, friendly, even, "Mother," the message said, "come celebrate the festival with me. I will send my personal ship to bring you safely." Agrippina read the invitation carefully. Suspicion was natural to her by now. The tension between her and Nero had been growing for months. Rumors were spreading throughout the palace. Everyone knew their relationship had become poisonous, but refusing the invitation would make their conflict public. And Agrippina believed something important. She believed she could still control her son. After all, she had shaped him since childhood. She had placed a crown on his head. Part of her still believed Nero would never truly destroy the woman who made him emperor. She accepted. The night before the journey, Nero arranged a banquet in Baiae. Agrippina arrived at the villa and was greeted warmly, too warmly. Witnesses later described Nero's behavior that night as strangely affectionate. He embraced his mother repeatedly. He held her close. He kissed her forehead. For a brief moment, it almost looked like the relationship between them had healed. The famous Roman historian Tacitus paid special attention to this moment in his writings, because something about Nero's behavior seemed unusual, almost emotional, almost conflicted. It was possible that for a brief second Nero felt something close to guilt. Maybe he remembered his childhood. Maybe he remembered when Agrippina was simply his mother, not the woman controlling his empire, or maybe it was just a performance. Because when the banquet ended, Nero personally escorted Agrippina to the harbor. The ship waited there under the moonlight, beautiful, elegant, exactly as promised. The crew helped Agrippina aboard. Her attendants followed. The cabin inside was decorated with expensive fabrics and soft couches designed for comfort during the journey. Everything looked perfect, too perfect. Nero watched from the dock as the ship slowly pulled away into the dark Mediterranean. Then he returned to the villa and waited. Out at sea, the night was calm. The water barely moved. Agrippina rested inside the cabin with one of her closest attendants, a woman named Asaronia. Servants moved quietly around the ship. Nothing seemed unusual. Then, suddenly, the trap activated. With a violent crack, the roof of the cabin collapsed. Massive wooden beams crashed downward without warning. Screams erupted. Acerronia was struck instantly, crushed beneath the falling structure. The weight shattered her body, killing her almost immediately. But Agrippina was not standing where the builders expected. The collapsing beam struck the couch beside her instead of her body. She was thrown violently to the side, injured but alive. Chaos erupted across the ship. Sailors shouted in confusion. Passengers screamed in terror. And then the second mechanism triggered. The hidden release inside the hull opened. Water began rushing into the ship. The vessel started sinking. Fast, Agrippina lay on the damaged deck, her mind racing. Years of political survival had trained her instincts. This was no accident. This was murder. Her son's murder. She looked around at the panic unfolding around her. The ship was tilting. Water was rising. There was only one choice left. She jumped. The cold Mediterranean water swallowed her instantly. Agrippina was 50 years old. She had spent most of her life in palaces, surrounded by servants and luxury. She was not a trained swimmer, but survival had been her greatest talent since childhood. She fought through the dark water, forcing her arms and legs to keep moving. Around her, other passengers screamed and drowned. Some were trapped beneath wreckage. Others simply vanished beneath the waves. Agrippina kept swimming. The shoreline was far away. Her muscles burned. Her lungs screamed for air, but she refused to die. Stroke after stroke, she pushed through the freezing water, until finally, her hands touched sand. She dragged herself onto the beach, coughing seawater, bleeding, exhausted, but alive. Again, once she recovered enough strength to speak, Agrippina did something remarkable. She didn't accuse Nero. She didn't threaten revenge. Instead, she sent him a calm message. I survived your accident, my son. Do not worry. I am safe. When Nero received the message, witnesses said his face turned completely pale till he read the words once. Then again, his advisors watched the emperor freeze. His mother had survived poison. She had survived a collapsing ship. And now she knew someone had tried to kill her. The room filled with silence. Finally, Nero looked up at his advisors. What do I do now? He asked point one of them. The philosopher Seneca answered quietly. There is no more pretending. Nero's voice trembled slightly. She will come for me. Seneca nodded. Yes. The room remained silent for a moment. Then another advisor spoke the brutal truth. It is her or you. The clever plans had failed. The traps had failed. The engineering had failed. Now there was only one option left. N-O poison, N-O accidents. Just men. And swords. That same night, Nero gave a final order that a squad of soldiers would travel to Agrippina's villa. They would not hide their intentions. They would not pretend anything had happened by mistake. They would simply kill her, directly, brutally, and finally end the war between mother and son. But Agrippina had one final moment left in this story, that a moment so. Chilling that Roman historians recorded her last words for nearly 2,000 years. Because when the soldiers arrived, she did not beg. She did not scream. She gave them an order. The message Agrippina sent to Nero was calm. Too calm. I survived your accident, my son. Do not worry. I am safe. Those words weren't just reassurance. They were a warning. Because both of them understood what they really meant, that I know what you try to do. And I'm still alive. Inside the palace at Baiae, Nero felt the walls closing in around him. The poison had failed. The ship had failed. Now Agrippina was alive, aware of the attempt on her life, and capable of striking back. And if there was one thing Nero understood about his mother, it was this. She never forgave betrayal. For years she had controlled Rome. Through him, she had manipulated the Senate, destroyed rivals, and eliminated anyone who stood between her son and power. If Agrippina decided to remove Nero now, she had the intelligence and the political connections to do it. The war between them had reached its final stage. Point one of them would die at Nero's advisors gathered in a quiet room, watching the emperor pace across the floor like a man cornered by his own shadow. Finally, Nero stopped and turned toward them. What do I do? The philosopher Seneca, one of the few men Nero still trusted, spoke carefully. You cannot undo what has happened. Nero stared at him. She knows. Yes. She will accuse me. Yes. The silence in the room became heavy. Another advisor stepped forward, the naval commander Anicetus. Unlike the philosophers and politicians surrounding Nero, Anicetus was a soldier. His mind worked in simpler, harsher ways that he didn't speak about morality, he spoke about survival. This ends tonight, Anicetus said. Nero looked at him. How? Anicetus answered without hesitation, send men. No poison and no tricks. Just soldiers. They would go to Agrippina's villa under the cover of darkness and finish what the collapsing ship had failed to do. Nero hesitated for only a moment. Then he nodded. The order was given. That night, Anicetus gathered a small group of armed men and sailed toward Agrippina's villa along the coast. The moon hung low over the Mediterranean. The water was quiet. The same sea that had just tried and failed to kill her. Inside the villa, Agrippina rested in her bedroom. Most of her servants had already fled. They could feel the danger building around her like a storm. Anyone who stayed risked being caught in the violence that was coming as, the once busy household was now nearly silent. Agrippina lay in bed, recovering from the injuries she had suffered when the ship collapsed. Her body ached. Her muscles were exhausted from the long swim to shore, but her mind remained sharp. She knew Nero would not stop. She had survived his trap. Now he would send something. Simpler, something direct. The sound came late at night. Heavy footsteps outside the villa. Then the crash of a door being forced open. Boots echoing through the hallway. Agrippina closed her eyes for a moment. Not in fear, in understanding. This was the end of the game. The bedroom door burst open. Anicetus entered first, holding a heavy club. Behind him came several soldiers carrying drawn swords. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp. Agrippina slowly sat up in her bed and looked at them, and screaming, and begging. Just a calm, steady gaze. For a moment, even the soldiers hesitated. They weren't facing a helpless victim. They were facing the woman who had once ruled Rome from behind the throne. The woman who had made Nero emperor. Anicetus stepped forward and raised a club. The first blow struck her head. The impact knocked her backward onto the bed. Blood ran down her face. The soldiers moved closer. One of them raised his sword. This was the moment. The final moment. And Agrippina did something that shocked everyone in the room. Instead of begging for mercy, she reached down and tore open the front of her nightgown, exposing her stomach. Then she shouted a command. Strike here. Her voice was strong despite the blood running across her face. Strike the womb. The soldier froze. Agrippina's eyes burned with something far stronger than fear. Strike the womb that bore him. Those were her final words. Not a plea, not a curse. An accusation. She wanted the world to remember exactly where Nero had come from. The soldier finally drove the sword downward. The blade plunged in her stomach. Once, twice, again. Agrippina didn't scream. She didn't call for Nero. She simply stared at the men killing her until the light slowly faded from her eyes. The woman who had poisoned an emperor, manipulated the Senate, and controlled the most powerful man in the world was dead. The soldiers left her, body on the blood-soaked bed, and returned to report to Nero. When they arrived back at the palace, Nero demanded every detail. They told him everything. How she had faced them. How she had spoken. How she had ordered them to strike the womb. Nero listened in silence. Then he did something few expected. According to several Roman historians, Nero went to see the body himself. He stood over his mother's corpse and examined it carefully. Not with grief, not with regret, but with cold curiosity. He made quiet observations about her body, almost like a doctor studying a patient. The woman who had once dominated his life was now nothing more than a lifeless figure on a bed. When he finished, Nero ordered wine. He drank, he ate, and eventually he went to sleep. But peace didn't last long, because the second night after her death, the dreams began. In the darkness of his sleep, Nero saw his mother again, not as she had been in life, but surrounded by the Furies, the ancient goddesses of vengeance. Their torches burned with black fire. They chased him through endless hallways. When they caught him, their hands wrapped around his throat. and he woke up choking, night after night. The same nightmare, the same ghost. Agrippina had died, but she had not left him, and the empire Nero now ruled alone was about to learn something terrifying. Killing his mother had not freed him. It had broken the last barrier inside his mind. Because once a man crosses that line, there are no limits left, and Nero would soon prove that too. All of Rome. For one night, Nero slept. The palace was quiet. The war that had poisoned his life for years was finally over. Agrippina was dead. The woman who had controlled his childhood, his throne, his every decision was gone. And at first, Nero felt something close to relief, freedom. For the first time since becoming emperor, he no longer felt his mother's presence behind him in the Senate chamber, in whispering voice correcting his words, and calculating eyes watching his decisions, in shadow, reminding him that the crown on his head belonged to her ambition. He was finally alone. But freedom can be dangerous when a person has never learned how to use it. Because Agrippina had controlled Nero his entire life. She had guided him, manipulated him, forced his choices. Without her, Nero had something he had never truly experienced before: absolute power, and no one strong enough left to control him. The first cracks appeared almost immediately. Nero began spending less time governing the empire. Instead, he focused on the things he actually loved: music, poetry, theater. Nero. Ruling Rome felt boring. Performing felt exciting. He began appearing on stage in private performances, singing and acting while a small group of nobles were forced to sit and watch. Roman emperors were supposed to be dignified leaders, generals, statesmen, men of discipline. Actors were considered socially low in Roman culture, barely above criminals. Yet here was the emperor of Rome performing on stage like a traveling entertainer. First people laughed quietly behind closed doors, but no one dared laugh where Nero could hear it, because something had changed in him after Agrippina's death. The young emperor had learned a terrifying lesson. If you can kill your own mother, you can kill anyone, and Nero soon began proving that lesson. The first victim was someone who had always been a threat: his half-brother, Britannicus. Britannicus was the biological son of Emperor Claudius, the rightful heir before. Agrippina manipulated events to place Nero on the throne. For years, Britannicus had been kept in the palace like a quiet shadow, watched closely but not harmed. But after Agrippina's death, Nero no longer saw any reason to tolerate rivals. One night during a dinner banquet, Britannicus was sitting at the table with Nero and several important guests. The servants brought wine. Britannicus took a drink. Seconds later, his body stiffened. His eyes widened. Foam began forming at the corner of his mouth. He collapsed onto the floor, convulsing violently. The room filled with shocked silence. Everyone knew what had happened. Poison. The same method Agrippina had once used on Claudius. The same weapon Nero had tried to use against his mother. Britannicus shook uncontrollably as his body shut down. Within moments, he was dead. The guests looked at Nero. The emperor remained calm. Almost bored, that he casually explained that Britannicus had always suffered from epilepsy and that the seizure had simply been too severe. One argued. One questioned. Because everyone understood the truth, and everyone understood the danger of speaking it. But Nero's violence did not stop there. Soon he turned against someone even closer: his own wife, Octavia. Octavia had been married to Nero years earlier to strengthen his claim to the throne. She was the daughter of Emperor Claudius and widely respected by the Roman people. She had done nothing wrong, in fact. Many Romans admired her for her quiet dignity. But Nero had grown tired of her. He had fallen in love with another woman, a beautiful and ambitious woman named Poppaea Sabina. Poppaea wanted more than just Nero's affection. She wanted to become empress. And there was only one obstacle standing in the way. Octavia Nero accused his wife of crimes. False crimes. He claimed she had been unfaithful. The accusations were ridiculous, but they served their purpose. Octavia was first exiled from Rome. The people were furious when they heard the news. Crowds protested in the streets, demanding her return. For a brief moment, Nero gave in to the pressure and allowed Octavia to come back. But Poppaea was not finished. Soon another accusation appeared. This time the punishment was final. Octavia was arrested, taken away from the palace, and executed. Her head was severed from her body and sent to Poppaea as proof. The message was clear. Anyone could family to friends at wives that it didn't matter. Rome was beginning to understand something chilling about their emperor. Nero had crossed a line inside himself when he killed Agrippina. Before that moment, there had still been boundaries, fear, limits. But once a man learns he can destroy the person who gave him life, every other boundary becomes meaningless. The empire continued functioning, but fear began spreading through the Senate and aristocracy. One wrong word could mean death. One glance, interpreted the wrong way, could mean execution. And Nero's behavior grew stranger with every passing year. He started competing in musical contests, forcing judges to declare him the winner. He performed long concerts where no one was allowed to leave, even if they were sick or exhausted. Some people reportedly pretended to faint just to be carried out of the room. Others secretly climbed down walls or slipped through hidden exits to escape his endless performances. But Nero didn't notice, or maybe he didn't care, because the empire he ruled was becoming something very different from the one Agrippina had helped him inherit. And the ghost of the woman he killed still followed him in the quiet hours of the night, in the darkness of sleep. Agrippina returned again and again, the Furies beside her, the torches burning, her hands reaching for his throat. Nero woke up gasping, his heart pounding. Priests were summoned. Magicians, exorcists, sacrifices were performed to cleanse the palace. Nothing worked, because some ghosts are not spirits. Some ghosts are guilt. And Nero was about to descend even deeper into madness, a madness that would soon set Rome itself on fire. The battle that followed was not a single clash of steel, but a series of brutal encounters that stretched across the broken slopes and narrow paths surrounding the pass. The Spartans had prepared for this moment their entire lives. From childhood, they had endured the relentless training of the agoge, where hunger, pain, and hardship were tools meant to carve boys into warriors. Now, standing shoulder to shoulder in the narrow corridor of Thermopylae, those lessons revealed their purpose. The Persian forces surged forward again, confident in their overwhelming numbers. Rank after rank advanced beneath banners that seemed to stretch endlessly across the hills. Yet when they reached the confined space of the pass, their advantage dissolved. Only a few men could fight at once, and the Spartans used that reality with terrifying efficiency. Leonidas gave the command. The Spartan line moved forward in perfect unity, shields overlapping, spears thrusting with disciplined precision. The first wave of Persian soldiers collapsed against the wall of bronze and iron. Their lighter armor and shorter weapons proved almost useless against the Spartans' longer spears and heavier shields. The clash of metal echoed through the cliffs. Dust and sweat mixed with the metallic scent of blood as the Spartans advanced step by step, pushing the enemy back. Behind them, the allied Greek troops watched in awe. They had heard stories of Spartan warriors their entire lives. Tales of discipline, fearlessness, and brutal training. But witnessing it was something entirely different. The Spartans did not fight like ordinary men. They moved like a single organism, each warrior trusting the one beside him completely. When a Spartan's spear shattered, he stepped back without hesitation. Another warrior instantly filled the space. When a man fell, the line closed around him without breaking formation. It was relentless. Wave after wave of Persian soldiers attempted to force their way through the pass. Each time they were driven back, leaving the narrow ground littered with bodies. Xerxes watched from a distant vantage point, disbelief slowly replacing his earlier confidence. His army had conquered empires. Cities had surrendered without resistance. Entire nations had collapsed before the might of Persia. And yet here, in a narrow strip of land between mountain and sea, a few thousand Greeks refused to yield. Worse still, 300 Spartans stood at the heart of the defense, fighting with a ferocity that defied logic. The Persian king ordered his elite warriors forward. The immortals point 10,000 of the empire's most skilled soldiers marched toward the pass, their polished armor glinting beneath the harsh sun. These men were veterans of countless campaigns, trained to crush resistance wherever it appeared. But even they struggled in the confined terrain. The Spartans did not panic when the immortals approached. Instead, they adjusted their tactics. Leonidas ordered controlled retreats, drawing the Persian elites deeper into the pass where the narrow ground robbed them of maneuverability. Then, at the perfect moment, the Spartans surged forward again. The immortals, despite their reputation, began to falter. Spears struck shields. Blades clashed. Warriors fell. What should have been a swift victory became a grinding stalemate that humiliated the greatest army in the world. Day after day, the battle continued. The Persians attacked repeatedly, confident that numbers alone would eventually break the defenders. But the Spartans had been trained to endure suffering beyond what ordinary soldiers could imagine. They fought through exhaustion, through wounds, through the relentless pressure of an enemy that seemed endless. Each night the Greeks repaired their formations, tended their wounded, and prepared for the next assault. Each morning the Persians returned, and each morning they failed again. For Xerxes, the situation was becoming intolerable. His massive army was being delayed by a force so small it should have been crushed instantly. The campaign schedule was slipping. Supplies were being consumed faster than expected. The psychological impact of the resistance was spreading throughout the ranks. Soldiers began whispering, "How could so few hold back so many?" It was during this growing frustration that fate intervened, that a local man named Ephialtes approached the Persian camp. He knew the mountains surrounding Thermopylae better than anyone. Hidden within those cliffs was a narrow path, barely visible to outsiders. It wound through the hills and eventually descended behind the Greek defensive position. For a price, Ephialtes offered to reveal the route. The opportunity was too valuable to ignore. Xerxes immediately dispatched a large force of Persian troops to follow the secret path under cover of darkness. If they could reach the rear of the Greek forces, the defenders would be trapped between two armies. The narrow pass that had protected them would become a prison. That night, while the Greeks rested beside their campfires, Persian soldiers quietly climbed the hidden trail through the mountains. But the Spartans had not ignored the possibility of betrayal. Scouts had been placed along the surrounding heights. Eventually, one of these patrols detected movement in the darkness. The warning reached Leonidas before dawn. The king listened calmly as the messenger delivered the report. The enemy was approaching from behind. The pass would soon be surrounded. The moment everyone had feared had arrived. Yet Leonidas did not panic. Instead, he gathered the Greek commanders and explained the situation with cold clarity. The position was no longer defensible. Remaining here meant certain death for the entire army. But if the Allied forces withdrew immediately, many of them might still escape. The room fell silent as the realization settled over the assembled leaders. Someone would need to stay behind. Someone would need to hold the pass long enough for the others to retreat. Leonidas already knew who that would be. The Spartans had come to Thermopylae fully aware that survival was never guaranteed. Their culture had taught them that death in battle was not a tragedy if it served a greater purpose. The king dismissed most of the allied Greek soldiers, ordering them to withdraw while they still could. Some left reluctantly. Others refused, and a small number of Thespians chose to remain, unwilling to abandon the Spartans who had fought beside them. The Thebans, bound by political pressure and circumstance, also stayed. When the sun rose over Thermopylae that morning, the Persian army discovered that the Greek defensive line had changed. The remaining warriors stood ready. They knew the enemy would soon arrive from both directions, and they intended to fight anyway. The final stand was about to begin. The men tightened their armor, lifted their shields, and prepared to face the largest army the world had ever seen. For the Spartans, the end was no longer a question, only how long they could make it last. Dawn rose slowly over the cliffs of Thermopylae, but the air no longer carried the tense anticipation of earlier days. This morning felt different. The remaining warriors understood that the pass they had defended so fiercely was no longer a shield. It had become a battlefield of sacrifice. Leonidas stood among his men as the first light touched the bronze of their armor. Around him were the 300 Spartans, the Thespians who had refused to leave, and the reluctant Thebans who had remained as well. The rest of the Greek army had already withdrawn during the night, moving south to warn the cities of the coming storm. The plan had worked. Greece would have time to prepare. Now it was their turn to fulfill the final duty. Far across the plain, the Persian army stirred. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers moved like a living tide, their banners rising as the sun climbed higher. Word had already spread through the Persian ranks. The Greeks were trapped. Xerxes himself watched from his command position, confident that the long delay at Thermopylae was finally about to end. But the Spartans were not preparing for defeat. They were preparing for one last attack. Leonidas gave the order. Instead of remaining behind their defensive wall, as they had during previous days, the Greeks marched forward into the wider section of the pass. The movement surprised the Persian commanders. The trapped defenders were advancing rather than retreating. Then the Spartans charged. Their formation struck the front ranks of the Persian army with a violence that stunned everyone watching. Spears crashed into shields. Bronze blades tore through armor. The Spartans fought not like men seeking survival, but like warriors determined to carve their names into history. The Persians pushed forward in massive numbers, but chaos spread through their lines as the Spartans drove into them with terrifying discipline. Each warrior moved with practiced precision, covering the man beside him, striking quickly and stepping forward again. The ground quickly turned red. Persian soldiers fell in waves, unable to overwhelm the tightly packed defenders quickly enough. Even as arrows darkened the sky and new ranks of enemy soldiers rushed forward, the Spartans continued to advance deeper into the battlefield. The fighting became savage. Spears broke. Swords replaced them. When swords shattered, warriors used daggers. When even those were lost, they fought with fists, shields, and raw strength. Some Persian commanders attempted to surround the Greeks, but the Spartans rotated their formation constantly, adapting to the pressure from every direction. Their training allowed them to fight with brutal efficiency even as exhaustion and wounds began to take their toll. Among the Spartans, Leonidas fought at the front. The king did not command from the rear. He stood in the thick of the battle, striking alongside his soldiers. His presence drove them forward with renewed fury. The Persians understood something critical. If Leonidas fell, the spirit of the defenders might finally break. Elite units were ordered to focus their attack directly on the Spartan king. The clash around him intensified. Persian warriors surged forward again and again, desperate to bring down the man who had delayed their entire invasion. The Spartans around Leonidas formed a tight protective circle, cutting down anyone who approached. But even legends cannot escape fate forever. During the chaos of the battle, Leonidas was struck. The Spartan king fell among his men. For a brief moment, the battlefield seemed to freeze. Then the Spartans exploded with rage. Their formation collapsed inward as warriors fought desperately to recover the body of their fallen king. The Persians attempted to seize it as a trophy. Knowing the psychological value, it held 0.4 separate charges erupted around Leonidas' body. The Spartans drove the Persians back again and again, refusing to allow the king to be taken. The struggle was brutal beyond description. Men slipped in blood, shields splintered, armor shattered under the weight of endless blows. Finally, the Spartans succeeded. They pulled the body of Leonidas back into their shrinking defensive circle. But the situation had grown even worse from the mountain path behind them. The Persian flanking force had now descended. The Greeks were surrounded completely. Arrows rained down from every direction. The Spartans formed their final line on a small mound within the pass, surrounded by fallen warriors for both armies. Their numbers were now dangerously thin, yet their resolve remained unbroken. The Persians closed in from all sides. What followed was not a battle. It was a storm of violence that consumed everyone still standing point one by one. The remaining defenders fell where they stood, their shields locked together until the very end. The Thespians fought beside them with equal courage, refusing every chance to surrender. Even the Thebans, trapped by circumstance, found themselves caught in the same desperate struggle, and still the Spartans fought, even as arrows filled the air. Even as the Persian army closed around them like an iron wall, the last warriors of Thermopylae stood their ground, surrounded by thousands. They had known this moment would come. They had marched toward it willingly, and in those final moments, as the sky darkened with arrows and the Persian army surged forward one last time, the Spartans delivered their final message to the world. Some men would rather die free than live under a king. The last defenders of Thermopylae fell beneath a storm of arrows and steel. When the fighting finally ended, silence slowly returned to the narrow pass that had witnessed one of the most extraordinary stands in human history. Bodies covered the ground. Persian soldiers stood among the fallen, exhausted and shaken. Many of them had never faced resistance like this before. They had expected a quick victory against a small force of Greeks. Instead, thousands of their comrades lay dead around them. At the center of the battlefield lay the body of Leonidas. Xerxes ordered the corpse found and brought before him. The Persian king had waited days for this moment. The man who had dared to defy the greatest empire on earth was finally defeated. But victory had come at a cost that few had expected. According to ancient accounts, Xerxes was furious. Not only had his army suffered heavy losses, but the delay at Thermopylae had given the Greek city-states valuable time to prepare for the coming invasion. Still, the road south was now open. The Persian army began moving again. Thousands of soldiers marched through central Greece like an unstoppable storm. Villages were abandoned before the army even arrived. Farmers fled their homes, carrying whatever they could as they rushed towards safer territory. News of Thermopylae spread quickly. Messengers rode from city to city carrying the same message. The pass had fallen. The Persians were coming. For many Greeks, the news created deep fear. If 300 Spartans and their allies could not stop Xerxes, what chance did anyone else have? Some cities chose the path of survival. They surrendered to Persia, offering submission in exchange for protection. Others hesitated, unsure whether resistance was still possible. But in several places, the sacrifice at Thermopylae had the opposite effect. It inspired defiance in Sparta. The news of Leonidas' death was received with grim pride. Spartan culture had always taught that dying in battle for the state was the highest honor a warrior could achieve. Leonidas had fulfilled that duty completely. The Spartans did not mourn him as a victim. They honored him as a legend. Meanwhile, in Athens, the situation was far more urgent. The city stood directly in the path of the Persian advance. Unlike Sparta, Athens did not rely primarily on land warfare. Its greatest strength lay at sea. Years earlier, a brilliant Athenian leader named Themistocles had convinced the city to build a powerful navy. Many citizens had questioned the decision at the time, wondering why Athens needed hundreds of warships. Now the reason was becoming clear. Themistocles understood something crucial about the Persian invasion. Even though Xerxes commanded an enormous army, that army depended heavily on its fleet. Persian ships transported supplies, troops, and communication along the Greek coastline. If the fleet could be defeated, the massive land army would suddenly face serious logistical problems. But first, Athens had to survive. As the Persian army moved closer, the Athenians made a shocking decision. They abandoned their city. Families packed their belongings and boarded ships. Others fled to nearby islands or to the Peloponnese, where Spartan forces were gathering for defense. The once vibrant city slowly emptied as thousands of citizens evacuated. Soon, Athens stood nearly deserted. When the Persian army finally arrived, they found little resistance. Xerxes' forces entered the city and burned large portions of it, including sacred temples on the Acropolis. From the Persian perspective, this seemed like a complete victory. The Greeks had been crushed at Thermopylae. Their greatest city now burned. But beneath the surface, a different plan was forming. The Greek fleet, made up primarily of Athenian ships along with vessels from other allied city-states, gathered in the narrow waters near the island of Salamis. There, Themistocles began preparing for the next stage of the war. Themistocles knew that the Persian navy was enormous, far larger than the Greek fleet. Fighting them in open water would likely end in disaster. But the geography of Greece offered another possibility. The straits around Salamis were narrow, filled with tricky currents and tight maneuvering space. In such conditions, the massive Persian fleet would struggle to coordinate its movements. The smaller, more agile Greek ships could turn that chaos into an advantage. But convincing the Greek commanders to risk everything on this strategy was not easy. Many leaders believed the fleet should retreat south to defend the Peloponnese instead. They feared that if the navy were destroyed, the war would be lost instantly. Themistocles argued the opposite. If they retreated, the Persians would control the sea completely. Greece would slowly collapse city by city. The debate grew intense. Time was running out. Meanwhile, the Persian fleet was approaching the Greek position. Soon, another battle would begin. But this time, the fate of Greece would not be decided in a narrow mountain pass. It would be decided on the water, and the man who would shape that battle had already begun setting a trap that even the powerful King Xerxes did not see coming. The waters around the island of Salamis were calm, but the calmness was deceiving. Hundreds of Greek ships floated in tight formation near the island's rocky coastline. Sailors moved quietly across the decks, checking ropes, sharpening weapons, and preparing their ships for battle. The smell of salt, wood, and pitch filled the air as the fleet waited. But inside the Greek command council, tension was rising. The commanders of the allied cities argued fiercely about what to do next. Many of them believed the fleet should retreat south toward the Peloponnese, where Spartan land forces were constructing defensive walls across the narrow Isthmus of Corinth. From their perspective, abandoning Salamis made sense. If the Persian navy destroyed the Greek fleet here, there would be nothing left to stop Xerxes from dominating the sea completely. But Themistocles strongly disagreed. He understood something that many of the other commanders refused to accept. If the fleet retreated now, the Persians would simply surround the Peloponnese. With their overwhelming naval power, they could land troops wherever they wished. The war would slowly suffocate Greece. The only real chance of victory was here at Salamis, but convincing the others was nearly impossible. Many leaders feared risking everything in a single battle. Themistocles realized that debate alone would not save Greece, so he decided to take a dangerous gamble. Late that night, while most of the Greek commanders were still arguing about strategy, Themistocles secretly sent a messenger across the water to the Persian fleet. The message was meant for Xerxes himself that It claimed that the Greek alliance was falling apart. According to the message, many Greek commanders were planning to escape during the night. If the Persians moved quickly and blocked the exits from the strait, they could trap the entire Greek fleet and destroy it before it had the chance to flee. It was a lie. But it was a brilliant lie. Themistocles knew exactly how Xerxes would think. The Persian king had already witnessed Greek resistance at Thermopylae, but he also knew that the Greek city-states were often divided by politics and rivalry. A report of internal disagreement would seem completely believable, and it did. When Xerxes received the message, he saw an opportunity for a decisive victory. If the Greeks were truly trying to escape, blocking the straits could end the war in a single night. He immediately ordered his fleet to move. Hundreds of Persian ships began advancing toward Salamis under the cover of darkness. Their goal was simple: seal the narrow passages around the island so the Greek fleet would have nowhere to run. But in doing so, they were sailing directly into Themistocles' trap. As dawn approached, the Persian fleet had filled the narrow waters around the island. Their massive numbers, normally their greatest strength, had now become a serious problem. Ships crowded together. Movement became difficult. Commanders struggled to maintain formation in the tight space. Meanwhile, the Greek sailors were ready. Unlike the Persians, they knew these waters perfectly. Many of them had grown up sailing the rocky coastline of Greece. They understood the currents, the winds, and the narrow channels between the islands. As the first light of morning appeared on the horizon, the Greek fleet began to move. War drums echoed across the water. Oars plunged into the sea in perfect rhythm as the ships accelerated forward. The long, narrow warships, called triremes, cut through the water with deadly speed. Each vessel carried a bronze ram at its bow, designed to smash into enemy ships with devastating force. The Greeks did not wait for the Persians to organize themselves. They attacked immediately. The first collision shattered the quiet of the morning. Greek ships slammed into the sides of Persian vessels, tearing open their hulls, which splintered as crews shouted and scrambled across crowded decks. Some Persian ships attempted to turn, but there was no room. More Greek ships surged forward. The narrow straits turned into chaos. The larger Persian fleet struggled to maneuver, their ships bumping into one another as commanders shouted conflicting orders. Some vessels became trapped between allies, unable to move while Greek ships rammed them repeatedly. Meanwhile, the Greek crews fought with controlled aggression. Rowers pushed their ships forward with powerful strokes. Marines boarded damaged Persian vessels, fighting hand-to-hand on slippery decks. Above the battlefield, Xerxes watched from a high cliff overlooking the sea. He had chosen the position specifically so he could witness the destruction of the Greek fleet. Instead, he began to see something very different. The Persian navy, the pride of his empire, was collapsing into confusion. Ship after ship was destroyed or forced onto the rocky shores. Greek vessels darted through the chaos like predators, striking quickly before pulling away to attack again. What Xerxes had believed would be a swift victory was becoming a disaster. The trap had closed, and the fate of the Persian invasion was beginning to change. The morning sun shone down on the waters of Salamis, but it illuminated chaos, not calm. The Persian fleet, once an unstoppable tide, now found itself trapped in a narrowing corridor between rocky cliffs. Ships pressed against each other, unable to maneuver, their oars tangled, sails ripped, and commanders shouting conflicting orders in the confusion. The Greek triremes struck with precision. Bronze rams pierced the hulls of Persian vessels again and again, sending them crashing into one another or sinking into the waves. Marines leaped across decks, cutting down crews with swords and spears. Fire arrows streaked through the air, setting wooden ships ablaze, black smoke twisting above the water like a storm. Every Greek ship that moved acted as a predator, darting between the Persian vessels, striking where the enemy was weakest, then retreating before they could respond. The straits amplified the Greeks' advantage, turning the Persians' numbers into a liability. Crowded together, the large fleet could not coordinate. Confusion spread rapidly, and in the tight space, panic spread faster than swords or arrows ever could. In one such palace, long after the echoes of Thermopylae and Salamis had faded, a mother named Agraina, the younger, watched her son, Nero, with the same calculating gaze that Greek commanders had once observed the Persian advance. She understood influence, control, and the fragility of power. Where Leonidas' bravery had relied on physical strength and loyalty, Agraina's weapons were subtler. Whispers, poison, and manipulation. She had survived exile, political chaos, and even the madness of her own family's legacy. Her ambition was not for herself. Women could not rule Rome openly, but for the throne through her son. Every maneuver, every poison tested, every whispered command prepared Nero to inherit not just a crown, but her vision of power, the lessons of the past, of loyalty, sacrifice, and cunning, were alive in her mind. She understood that control over men, armies, and even emperors could be more decisive than the mightiest legions. Rome was a stage, and she intended to direct the performance. But ambition has a way of creating monsters. Just as the Greeks had once faced the unstoppable Persian forces with courage and strategy, Nero would eventually face his own monsters, those born from the very lessons his mother instilled in him. The line between teacher and creation would blur, just as strategy blurred with ambition and power with obsession. The palace was quiet, but the tension was thick. Every glance, every command, every whispered word to the Senate carried the weight of unseen threats. In these corridors, alliances shifted as easily as the tides at Salamis. And just as the Greek commanders had learned that even a small fleet could turn the tide against a massive empire, Nero would learn that a single misstep in loyalty, a single betrayal, or a single act of rebellion could destroy everything he thought he controlled. History was repeating itself, not with armies or fleets, but with hearts, minds, and the ambition that drove them. The ghosts of past strategies, sacrifices, and cunning battles lingered in the minds of those who rose to power, reminding them that to rule was to engage in an endless struggle between control and chaos. And in the shadows of Rome, Agraina prepared her son for the ultimate test, a world in which obedience could be demanded, but loyalty was never guaranteed, and where love and fear were tools wielded in equal measure. Agraina moved through the halls of Rome like a shadow, quiet, deliberate, and unchallenged. Her steps left no mark, but her presence was felt in every whispered word, every glance, every silent calculation. She understood the one rule of Roman power better than anyone. The throne was not inherited. It was seized, molded, and protected by those clever enough to control it. Her target was simple but dangerous. The throne, currently held by her husband, Claudius, and the line of succession, secured by his biological son, Britannicus. Agraina's son, Nero, was only a teenager, but she had already begun shaping him into a perfect instrument of her ambition. A boy trained to obey, to charm, and to act as if his will was his own, when in truth it mirrored hers. The plan required precision. Poison was subtle but effective. Patience was essential. She began by carefully studying Claudius' habits, his meals, his doctors, his routines. Every detail was an opportunity. Every small indulgence a chance to introduce her chosen method of elimination without raising suspicion. Agraina enlisted the services of Lusta, a professional whose skills in discreet assassination were known only to the most ambitious Roman matrons. Lusta's hands were steady, her mind precise. Together, they prepared a series of carefully calculated poisons, slow-acting, almost indistinguishable from natural illness. The goal was not only to remove Claudius, but to ensure the transition to Nero's power appeared seamless, even beneficial. The day arrived. Claudius sat at the table, unaware of the invisible hand guiding the final moments of his life. Agraina served the meal with a serene smile, her eyes never leaving his. The mushrooms were ordinary in appearance, extraordinary in effect. Within hours, the Emperor of Rome began to falter, struggling to breathe, coughing, choking on the slow-acting toxin that mimicked natural sickness. Meanwhile, Agraina ensured that the Senate and key political figures were prepared for the narrative that would follow. Britannicus, young and vulnerable, was to be sidelined. The reasoning was simple. Nero, already married to Octavia, Claudius' daughter, was capable and ready to govern. Any objection could be painted as immaturity or incompetence, by the time Claudius' life faded. Agraina had already woven the story that would justify Nero's rise. The Senate, impressed and persuaded, quickly endorsed the young boy as emperor. At 16 years old, Nero ascended the throne, his hand barely steady on the scepter, while Agraina's hand rested invisibly on his shoulder, guiding every motion, every word. For the first years, the plan worked perfectly. Nero became the puppet, and Agraina pulled the strings. When decrees were issued, her influence was hidden but absolute. Coins were minted bearing both their faces, a constant, silent reminder of her power. Every gesture, every command that seemed to flow from Nero's will was, in truth, hers. But even the most meticulously crafted control has its limits. Teenagers grow, ambition stirs, and obedience begins to strain under the weight of desire. Nero's first act of rebellion was subtle. A lover named Acte, a freed woman of no political value, who distracted him from the constant whisper of his mother's influence, that Agraina's fury was immediate. She stormed his chambers, her words sharp and threatening, reminding him that he owed everything to her. Yet, for the first time, Nero's gaze held something different. A coldness, a calculation, a shadow of the monster that would eventually emerge. The seeds of conflict had been sown. The palace, once under quiet domination, became a theater of tension and control. Whispers began to echo among attendants and senators, stories that blurred the line between rumor and reality. The Romans, who had seen emperors commit acts of unspeakable debauchery, were unsettled by what they observed between Agraina and Nero. an interplay of influence, obsession, and the subtle boundaries of power being tested in ways that made even the most jaded uneasy. Agraina had created the perfect instrument of her ambition. But as the boy grew, so too did the possibility that the instrument would play its own tune. The first cracks were small, a glance, a hesitation, a thought unspoken but felt. The empire of her design was thriving. Yet at its heart, the seeds of destruction were already stirring. Nero, though young, was no fool. He had been taught to obey, to mimic authority, to recite what his mother wished as law. But adolescence brought impulses Agraina could not fully control. He discovered pleasures and desires that were his own. A lover named Acti, laughter with companions outside the palace, even fleeting moments of rebellion in the Senate when he chose to hesitate, to question, to defy. Agraina noticed everything immediately. To her, every moment of independence was a crack in the carefully constructed palace of power. Every glance Nero stole for himself, every decision made without her prompting was a threat. She would not tolerate it. The tools she had used to control her husband Claudius and manipulate the Senate were not enough to bend a growing son whose mind was beginning to awaken to his own power. Her methods became extreme. She stormed into Nero's chambers without warning, her voice sharp as the dagger she would have used on anyone who defied her. She threatened, screamed, and reminded him, relentlessly, that without her, he would be nothing. She insinuated danger, whispered of rivals, of plots against him, and of the consequences of ignoring her advice. She pulled him close, often in ways that blurred boundaries, insisting that love and authority were inseparable. At first, Nero complied. The boy still carried the weight of gratitude and fear. But slowly, something darker began to stir in his mind. A seed planted long ago by years of manipulation, control, and whispered dominance was germinating into hatred. He began to observe, calculating his mother's every move. He noticed the poison in her smiles, the way her hands lingered in his life like chains. The realization came quietly, almost imperceptibly. The woman who had made him emperor could also be his undoing. There were subtle rebellions. Nero lingered longer with Acti, ignoring Agraina's impatience. He made small decisions without consultation, sending messages to the Senate, delaying decrees, testing whether he could act on his own. With each defiance, Agraina's fury grew. She escalated her control, whispering threats, orchestrating scenarios designed to scare him back into obedience. Yet each act only strengthened the cold resolve forming in Nero's heart. The palace became a theater of silent war. Walls that once symbolized safety and prestige now felt like prisons. Servants and attendants whispered about the tension, speculating on the madness behind closed doors. Even Roman elites, accustomed to scandal and intrigue, found themselves unsettled by the intensity of the mother-son dynamic. Rumors began to circulate. Some suggested Agraina had gone too far in her closeness, that the bond between her and Nero was no longer simply political, that obsession had crossed into darkness. Nero, however, was learning fast. The lessons of his mother were bitter, but they were lessons nonetheless. Power required decisiveness, cruelty, and the willingness to eliminate threats, even when those threats were blood. He understood that survival in Rome demanded more than charm or compliance. It demanded cunning, patience, and the ability to strike first. And so the seeds of violence took root. Agraina, confident in her lifelong mastery of control, did not realize that she had shaped not a puppet, but a predator. Nero's first attempts at independence, though subtle and careful, were merely the opening moves in a game that would soon escalate beyond manipulation into attempts on life itself. Poison would be tested, schemes would be deployed, and every act of control by Agraina would deepen the well of hatred in Nero's mind, preparing him for the day when the roles of teacher and creation would reverse. The palace, silent in the early hours, was alive with tension. Every room, every corridor, every shadowed corner could hold strategy, confrontation, or betrayal. The young emperor's heart beat with growing determination, and Agraina, believing herself untouchable, continued to weave her web of control, unaware that she was simultaneously teaching her son the very skills he would soon wield against her. But Nero's patience had reached its limit. The subtle defiance of a lover, the hesitation in decrees, the quiet glances that betrayed independence. Each one was a reminder that Agraina still held power over him, even as he sat on the throne of Rome. The boy who had once been her puppet now burned with a desire to sever the chain she had wrapped around him. The first attempt was simple: poison. Nero summoned Lusta, the same professional who had once served his mother so dutifully in the death of Claudius. Lusta, experienced and meticulous, prepared the strongest formula she had ever crafted, a lethal blend designed to overwhelm anyone not immune to its effects. Nero's instructions were precise. It must be swift, untraceable, final. Agraina, as always, remained composed. She accepted the meal, unaware to outsiders of the invisible war being waged across the table. Nero watched her intently, waiting for the signs, the tremor in her hands, the flush of weakness, the collapse of the once mighty figure who had controlled his every breath. Hours passed. Nero's anticipation grew. He leaned forward, eyes sharp, as Claudius had never been, waiting for the inevitable. But nothing came. Agraina ate, smiled, and spoke lightly, as if nothing had been attempted against her life. Shock and fury consumed Nero. His face drained of color as the realization hit. Poison, the most reliable method of Roman assassination, had failed. His mother, ever meticulous, had spent years fortifying her body against exactly this threat. She had built an immunity through repeated, controlled exposure, a lifetime of preparation that rendered the emperor's first attempt useless. The failure was more than frustration. It was a message. Agraina was untouchable by conventional means. She had outmaneuvered him once again, and her eyes, calm, piercing, and victorious, mocked him in ways words never could. Nero, the emperor, felt the first true taste of helplessness, and with it, his hatred deepened that he could not let this stand. Subtlety, strategy, and whispers had failed. He needed something more absolute. The first strike had been psychological. Now the stakes would rise to engineering and deception. A calculated attempt to end his mother's life in a spectacle that would leave no margin for survival. But Agraina, the survivor, the strategist, the mother who had shaped an emperor, was already anticipating his next move. Every thought, every plan Nero conceived had already been considered, measured, and countered. She had survived exile, poison, and political scheming. She had risen from the shadow of madness in her family. She would not fall so easily, even to her own son. And so the palace, silent and gleaming, became a battlefield not of armies, but of minds. Every glance, every decision, every whispered plan carried the weight of life and death. Rome, the city of marble and ambition, stood witness to a conflict more terrifying than any siege or naval battle. A war between mother and son, where love, hatred, and power were intertwined in ways that history would scarcely dare to describe. Nero, filled with rage, realized the war had only just begun. Poison had failed, but he would not fail. He would design a trap, a method of murder that required no subtlety, no chemical cunning, something mechanical, absolute, inescapable. And Agraina, ever vigilant, would see it coming, yet refused to submit without a fight. The game had escalated, and neither mother nor son would survive unchanged. Nero had exhausted subtlety. Poison had failed, whispers had failed, and the delicate manipulations that had once secured his obedience were now meaningless. His mother, Agraina, the architect of his rise, the teacher of ruthlessness and cunning, had survived every attempt to control her life and body. She had endured poisons that would have felled the strongest men. She had outlasted exile, manipulation, and betrayal. And now, the Emperor of Rome realized if she could survive the slow, deliberate cruelty of chemical death, he would need something more, something absolute. He summoned the finest engineers, shipbuilders, and craftsmen in Rome. men whose hands could shape wood and metal with the precision of a surgeon. Nero's instructions were meticulous, chillingly detailed. The ship must appear luxurious, inviting, even festive, a vessel worthy of a woman of power and status. But hidden in its design was a mechanism of death. The roof would collapse on command, a thunderous weight meant to crush anyone beneath it. The bottom would detach, sending the entire vessel to the depths of the Mediterranean. The plan was ingenious, cruel, and cowardly. A perfect murder disguised as misfortune. Agraina received Nero's invitation with a measured curiosity. The request was framed as filial concern, a chance for mother and son to reconcile, to celebrate the festival of Bai. Of course, she suspected nothing, yet she suspected everything. Suspicion was second nature to her, honed over decades of survival and intrigue. Refusing the invitation would raise questions, expose the fissure between mother and son, and signal weakness. And Agraina was nothing if not unyielding. So she went. The night before the voyage, Nero performed a facade of affection. He hugged her, kissed her forehead, held her close as if she were just a mother and not the orchestrator of his every command. Tacitus, the historian who would later record the horrors of this time, notes the peculiarity of this moment. Perhaps guilt touched Nero for a fleeting second, perhaps nostalgia, perhaps an instinctive fear of the act he was about to commit. And yet, the performance ended as all acts of deception do, with departure and intent to kill. Agraina boarded the vessel, reclining amidst opulence and comfort, surrounded by attendants who were unaware of the impending doom. The night was calm, the Mediterranean serene, and yet beneath the polished deck, the mechanisms of death waited. Nero's command came, a single signal that sent the entire top structure crashing down, splintering wood and iron, sending servants and obstacles into chaos. Screams tore through the night as the collapsing roof crushed Agraina's attendants, their bodies flattened beneath the engineered weight. Blood splattered across the deck. Yet Agraina, trained in survival, resilient and cunning beyond any ordinary measure, moved with instinct honed over decades. She was thrown, injured but conscious. The bottom of the ship began to detach, water rushing in with the cold inevitability of fate. The vessel began to sink, but Agraina was ready. She had spent her life anticipating death in its many forms. She dived into the black, frigid waters of the Mediterranean, muscles burning, lungs screaming, yet moving with determination that would have astonished even the most hardened soldiers. Other survivors floundered and drowned, but Agraina pressed on. Every stroke, every push through the water was a testament to a mind and body conditioned for survival, for the unthinkable. Hours later, she reached the shore, dragging herself on a sand slick with blood and salt water, coughing, bleeding, alive. Her mind raced, not with fear, but with calculation. She knew Nero had tried to kill her. She knew he had underestimated her. And she also knew that now, nothing could remain subtle. The balance had shifted. She sent a message immediately. "I survived your accident, my son. Don't worry, I'm safe." Nero's reaction was immediate and catastrophic. The blood drained from his face. Advisors whispered, fear gripping even the most seasoned of men. Seneca, the philosopher and counselor, leaned close. "She will come for you now. There is no more pretense. It is her or you." The implication struck Nero like a thunderbolt. Every assassination attempt, every plot, every carefully orchestrated plan had failed because Agraina was not just clever. She was prepared, unyielding, and relentless. The mother who had placed a crown on his head now threatened the very life of the emperor. That night, Nero's hands shook as he realized the only path left was direct confrontation. No subtleties, no mechanical no poison. Only soldiers, swords, and brute force could resolve the conflict. The empire he ruled from the throne suddenly felt smaller, confined by fear and a mother's unmatched will. The palace, once a monument to ambition and political cunning, had transformed into a battleground of shadows, whispers, and anticipation. Nero had sought to eliminate the one person who had made him emperor, only to discover that her survival instincts and decades of preparation had turned his schemes into lessons. And Agraina? She was not done. Each Nero escape, each display of cunning, each survival had only strengthened her resolve, sharpening the hatred and fear that now bound her and her son in a deadly, inescapable cycle. The war between them had entered a new phase. Rome itself, the city of emperors, senators, and soldiers, was a silent witness to a battle that would not leave a soul untouched. The chessboard was set, and the next moves would be lethal. Nero had run out of options. Every plot, every poison, every collapsing roof had failed. Agraina had survived them all. The woman who had shaped emperors, manipulated the Senate, and controlled the life of the most powerful man in the world had become untouchable by cunning alone. And now, only the blunt instrument of violence remained. That night, under the cover of darkness, Nero dispatched Anytus, a naval commander, with a squad of soldiers. Their orders were simple: enter Agraina's villa, find her, and kill her. No subtleties, no schemes, no hope for survival. The streets of Rome were quiet, the city unaware of the shadow, terror moving silently toward one of its most dangerous residents, the Agraina's villa. A sprawling residence of marble and frescoed halls was deceptively peaceful. Most servants had fled, anticipating the danger that was coming. Only Agraina remained, seated in her chambers, calm as a predator, aware that the hunt had begun. Every footstep echoed through the hallways, heavy boots announcing the approach of men who believed steel could surpass wit and experience. The door crashed open. Anytus led the charge, a club in hand, soldiers with swords drawn behind him. Agraina did not flinch. She did not scream. She simply rose from her chair, blood and sweat from her previous escape staining her silk garments, and faced them. Her eyes, sharp, calculating, defiant, met theirs with a quiet certainty that left the soldiers momentarily unsettled. Anytus swung the club. The impact caught Agraina's head, staggering her, but it did not break her resolve. She fell back slightly, blood trickling down her face, yet her gaze never faltered. A soldier stepped forward, sword raised, ready to end the life of the woman who had made an emperor. And then, in a final act of defiance, Agraina seized control of her own narrative. With a scream that echoed through the marble halls, she tore open her nightgown, exposing herself to the man who sought to destroy her. Her voice rang out like a command, an accusation, a curse. Ventre, strike the womb that bore him. Every word was deliberate. Every syllable carried the weight of a lifetime of ambition, cruelty, and survival. Even in the face of death, Agraina would not submit. She chose how she would be remembered, how her story would be told, even as blood poured from her body. The sword plunged in her abdomen repeatedly, and still she did not scream. She did not beg. She stared at the soldier until the light left her eyes, her final act a testament to a life lived in mastery of power, manipulation, and survival. The soldiers left, reporting back to Nero. That night, he went to see the corpse. Standing over the woman who had created him, he examined her with clinical detachment, commenting on her physique, her life, and the legacy she had left in him. He drank wine, ate, and eventually retired to his chambers, believing the nightmare was over. But sleep did not come peacefully. That first night passed in silence, but the second brought nightmares. Agraina's ghost emerged, not as the woman she had been in life, but transformed, surrounded by the Furies, the goddesses of vengeance, torches burning with black fire. She haunted him, chased him through corridors, strangled him with invisible hands. Every night, the vision repeated. No ritual, no exorcism, no priest could rid Nero of her presence. Rome cared little for an emperor's nightmares. The Senate cared for power, the city for spectacle. But Nero's mind began to fracture. Agraina's death, though physical, had left a mark deeper than any blade or poison could inflict. She had taught him that survival demanded ruthlessness, that control was absolute, and that betrayal was inevitable. And in her death, she ensured that Nero would carry her lessons to extremes he had not yet imagined. Every subsequent act of cruelty, the murder of Britannicus, the execution of Octavia, the punishment of Poppaea, was a continuation of a pattern she had instilled. Each act reinforced the lesson. Murder is power, and power justifies itself. Agraina had died, but in a sense she had never left. She lingered in the empire, in Nero's mind, in the nightmares that twisted his sleep. Rome would remember the chaos, the tyranny, the music played as the city burned. But beneath all of that, the truth was simple. A mother's ambition had created a monster, and the monster had survived to destroy everything in its path. With Agraina dead, Nero finally believed he was free. Free from her whispers, her manipulations, her omnipresent shadow. But freedom, as he would soon learn, was far more dangerous than control. Her lessons had been etched into him like poison into veins. Ambition without conscience, cruelty without hesitation, murder as a solution. And now, without her to restrain or guide him, those lessons unfurled in their full, terrifying force. The city of Rome, vast, vibrant, and teeming with both opportunity and corruption, became the stage for Nero's madness. He no longer hesitated. Senators who had once bowed to Agraina now bowed to him, but fear replaced respect. Every glance that displeased him, every whisper that hinted at dissent, every hesitation in obedience became a death sentence. Britannicus, his half-brother, had already been poisoned in the wake of Agraina's demise. His wife, Octavia, beheaded and presented to his new lover Poppaea, a chilling demonstration that blood was simply a tool in the game of power. Yet the external victories brought no peace. The empire he ruled was vast, yet every night, the shadow of his mother's presence haunted him. Her ghost, a relentless embodiment of vengeance, followed him into dreams that twisted into nightmares so vivid that sleep became a torment. In these dreams, Agraina appeared transformed, her eyes blazing with fury, her hands wrapped around his throat, dragging him through endless corridors until he woke choking and screaming. No ritual, no exorcism, no priest could sever her influence. She was as much a part of him as his own ambition, but the lessons she had taught were now weaponized in ways she had never intended. Nero's cruelty became absolute. He set the great fire of Rome, whether by accident, indifference, or design, as the city's streets burned and ash filled the air. Amid the chaos, he performed on stage, singing, acting, as if the suffering of thousands were nothing more than background music for his own twisted performance. His mind unraveled further as he declared himself a god, marrying a boy who resembled his deceased wife and forcing senators to treat the child as empress. Each act of violence became easier than the last, each murder a rehearsal for the next. The fear that had once restrained him melted, leaving only the raw, unbound expression of the lessons Agraina had imparted. He executed anyone who displeased him, who looked at him wrong, who failed to applaud his performances with sufficient enthusiasm. He ruled through terror, a reflection of the ruthless logic Agraina had drilled into him from childhood. Control requires obedience, and obedience requires fear. Yet, even at the height of his power, the past remained unshakable. Agraina's influence, inscribed into his psyche, continued to haunt every thought, every decision. He could destroy the living, but the dead were untouchable. He could conquer cities, exterminate rivals, and reconstruct the Senate in his image. But Agraina's ghost, the relentless embodiment of his first and most dangerous teacher, remained. She was the shadow of ambition, the lingering echo of obsession, the reminder that monsters are not born, they are made. Rome became both his kingdom and his prison. The people worshipped, feared, and whispered of a young emperor whose cruelty knew no bounds. Nero's descent into madness was total. The city burned, innocents perished, the halls of power became theaters of horror, and yet he persisted, driven by the lessons of the mother who had built him. And in the end, The story of Agraina and Nero became a legend of terror and ambition. A mother who created a monster, a son who surpassed even her cruelty. The empire endured, but the true lesson of Rome's darkest chapter was clear. Power untempered by conscience, ambition unbound by morality, and love twisted into possession can create monsters beyond reckoning. Agraina had placed the crown upon her son's head, whispered that he owed her everything, and he had. He had owed her his obedience, and in paying that debt through rebellion, murder, and madness, he honored the lesson she had taught him in the only way he could. Nero, finally unchained, finally free from his mother, became the living embodiment of her ambition and ruthlessness. Rome, the city of emperors, senators, and soldiers, learned a brutal truth that echoed through the centuries. Monsters do not need to be born. They only need the right teacher. Agraina's shadow, her cruelty, her ambition, and her lessons endured long after her death, shaping a son who would burn, murder, and terrify in ways history would never forget. The empire, the city, the blood-soaked halls of power, all were witnesses to a story that began with ambition, evolved through manipulation, and ended in absolute horror. And in the silence after Nero's screams, after Rome's flames died down, the truth remained undeniable. Ambition without restraint, love twisted into control, and the shaping hand of a mother could create a monster capable of destroying the world around him and himself. The legacy of Agraina and Nero endured, a cautionary tale etched into the annals of history. A dark reminder that the line between creation and destruction is thinner than we dare to imagine. And in the shadows of Rome, one lesson remained eternal. Power, once taught, is impossible to unlearn.